refugee families. And that is stopping soon. So there won't be any new families coming through this program. And then ICE was outside our hospital last week and outside one of the health centers we work with. So there's probably more, but anyways, I think it's kind of infiltrating all the lives. So thanks so much to our two panelists, Emily Barnes and Alice Cohen. Really appreciate you guys joining us. And I'll just ask you each to introduce yourself and say a word or two about the work that you do. Emily, let's start with you, please.
Sounds good. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Barnes. I'm a graduate student in the Boston University Counseling Psychology PhD program. I'm in my 5th year in the program. And I've spent the past 4 years training and working as a child and adolescent therapist at sites across Cambridge and Boston, working with kids and families struggling with anxiety and behavior concerns and other mental health issues. I'm a Boston resident, not Cambridge, but just across the river. And I also work on child anxiety research. And probably most relevant for tonight, I'm also involved in research evaluating some programs that aim to expand access to behavioral health care for disaster-affected youth. So have been involved in kind of evaluating how those programs are working to support kids and adolescents and families who have been impacted by both natural disasters and things like mass violence events, shootings. And so I'm happy to speak more about that work some tonight.
Great.
But happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much. Alice.
Hi, my name's Alice Cohen. I'm a Cambridge resident and also a parent of 2 kids who went through the Cambridge Public Schools. My title is Lead Teacher for Social Emotional Learning for CPS. So my job is pretty broad. I look at how schools are helping young people name and manage their emotions in terms of curriculum. And I also help educators a great deal in understanding and interpreting what drives behavior for young people, particularly behaviors that might be unexpected or problematic. And I also am sort of on call for things that come up in the district occasionally that seem complicated or difficult. So I'm in and out of the Cambridge Public Schools, usually 2 or 3 schools a day, most days. And I have a chance to see young people directly and how they're affected by the context in which they find themselves, no matter what that might be. So I feel like I have a good felt sense of kind of what young people are struggling with. And I still believe that the antidote is relationship, and that connection and relationship is probably the most beneficial thing we can do for young people, even when it might be difficult to maintain.
Great, thank you. And now we'll start with you, Alice, for this question. Have you, either of you, seen any repercussions yet about what's going on since January 20th? And if you do, or if you don't, any specific tips for parents and caregivers for if their children are exhibiting anxiety and fears? Alice.
So I just want to back up a tiny bit and say that the young people of Cambridge, and I'm pretty sure this is true in other places as well, are still suffering the neurobiological effects of the pandemic disruption in terms of level of functioning and what one might have learned in the grades that were missed during the pandemic. So we're seeing less frustration tolerance, some issues around social communication, some issues around compassion, cooperation, empathy, these kinds of things that we have had to kind of step back and think, what skill is missing here for someone who missed third grade or fourth grade or fifth grade, and how do we kind of teach those skills? So that existed before this came up. And this is a deeply troubling overlay for young people, because there's nothing worse as a human than to feel that what's being asked of you exceeds your capacity or your capacity to understand. And so I feel like there's a additional pressure now. And that being said, I want to say that most young people take their cues in how to respond to world events from their parents and caregivers. So it's really important for parents and caregivers to manage their own anxiety during this time, because kids are watching us all the time to see how we react and how we feel about things. So I think it's really important for parents, even if they're not expressly feeling it in that moment, to project safety and protection for their children. We are a family, and we can, we are going to be looking out for each other, and we have close relationships and attachments, and we need to use those things. I think young people respond very well to ritual and structure when they feel unmoored or loose. So the family rituals and structures that we have, it's very important to maintain those. I would totally limit young people's access to, say, television news right now, because I think it's confusing to figure out what is motivating some people to say some things that they're saying, and difficult for young people to understand. I think that kids are very good at asking us questions about what they want to know about. And some of the things that we're reading and realizing and experiencing are not things that children can understand yet. And so it's important for us to limit what we tell them, and not kind of overshare in the idea that, if we all know the same things, we'll all be able to react appropriately. I also think that it's important for young people to understand that there are still systems in place that stand with them and are interested in and invested in their safety beyond the family unit, people at school, teachers, after-school people, other community connections that we might have. We were, as humans, meant to be in community, and that has never felt more important than it does right now. So maintaining those relationships that young people have with these various programs, faith-based programs, whatever it is really important. It's easy to isolate when we are anxious, because it almost feels like it's hard to go out into the world. But I think it's important, insofar as it's possible, to kind of maintain those points of connection.
Thank you. And I would, completely hear what you're saying there. And I feel like the cities we live in too, Cambridge and Boston, are also feel protective in a lot of ways as much as they can. So, and the people who speak for them. Thank you. Emily, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think in terms of what I'm seeing, definitely a lot of worry and anxiety among friends and loved ones. And especially, I think, people in vulnerable populations right now, LGBTQ people, immigrants, other vulnerable populations. And I think I would say that it completely makes sense, of course, that anxiety is really normal, and there is so much right now that feels really scary and up in the air. And so it's okay to acknowledge those feelings in yourself and in your kids if your kids are expressing them, and to validate that, a lot of people are feeling that way right now. And I agree with what Alice said about, kids taking their cues from parents. So as much as you can, trying to practice your own emotion regulation, and, taking care of yourself, making sure that you're sleeping and that you're eating regularly, and that you are doing all of those things to keep yourself as kind of emotionally and physically healthy as you can. I think really important to talk to your kids about what they're hearing and what they know. And especially if your kids are worried about specific things in the news or events going on, asking them like what they've seen, what they've heard. Kids sometimes might not have the right information or might be confused. And so if you can correct any misinformation they might have heard and kind of give them more factual information, that can be really helpful. And definitely thinking about, what's developmentally appropriate for your kids, for their age, for their developmental stage, not oversharing with younger kids especially, but thinking about, what's appropriate for your kid. And answering questions honestly, and again, at a level that makes sense for them developmentally, asking how they're feeling about things. And it can sometimes be helpful to talk about efforts that adults are making to, keep us all safe. So if kids are worried about, I'm thinking about like the wildfires that was across the country, but if kids are worried about things like that, talking about, actions that you can take to keep yourself safe, how people in the community are working to keep everybody safe. And it is kind of that Mr. Rogers line, I think, about like finding the helpers and helping your kids find the helpers in their communities and pay attention to what those people are doing. I love that line. But I think it's really helpful for all of us and for adults too, to look for the helpers and try to be the helpers as adults in our communities. And so kind of finding those people who are working in a way that's in line with your values, and finding community with those people, finding ways that, if it's appropriate, if your child is old enough, maybe there are ways that they can get involved in the community and volunteer for organizations that are working toward causes they feel passionate about. I think there are some organizations in the community, for example, that make like welcome baskets for refugee families in the community. So that could be something that your kid might want to get involved with. So looking for different opportunities like that so that your child can feel like they're contributing positively to the community and can build those connections that are so important. And then I would also just echo what Alice was saying about routine and trying to maintain your routines as much as possible. Limiting access to distressing news and social media coverage, and kind of checking in if your kids have seen anything that is distressing to them, checking in about how they're feeling about that, and as much as possible trying to limit access to those distressing things.
Thank you. So lots of things that you guys talked about, I'd love to follow up on. Let's see. So social media for sure. We've done whole events on that, and trying to help keep that under control is very challenging. So any other thoughts you guys have on that? And then why don't we also talk a little bit more, if you have any other thoughts about the LGBTQ community, who now seems so vulnerable. And certainly our kids probably all know kids in that community, and any other thoughts about that? So Emily, any other thoughts about those particular two things, social media, any things for the LGBTQ community, things people may tell their children to reassure them, or if their children are in that community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in terms of social media, depending on the age of your kids, if your kids are already on social media, I would ask them like what they're seeing, and talk to them about who they're following and where they get their news from on social media. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and I think we're all vulnerable to it. So not making it a condescending thing of you don't know how to look for the right news, but like there is a lot out there, and we are all vulnerable to falling for misinformation at times. And so talking to your kids about how do you find good sources to follow, How do you know when a source is trustworthy? Maybe like looking for some places together where you can get trustworthy information. If this is an older teen, for example, you can have guardrails in place about, trying to maybe have a family rule of like, we all put our phones in a basket at a certain time in the evening, and we're not going to use our phones at night. I have known teens who have like privately admitted to me that their parents do that and that they really appreciate that their parents do that. And sometimes they say like, don't tell my parents, but I'm really glad that they have this rule of no phones at night, because they recognize that it is valuable for sleep and just mental well-being to have some limits in place. So sometimes even if teens protest, they do actually appreciate having that structure. And I think just you can also model for yourself as an adult, like how do you try to set some limits on your time on social media, or take breaks when you're getting really distressed by the things that you're seeing. And I think just having those conversations with teenagers and kind of letting them know that if they see something that's upsetting, they can always talk to you about it, and kind of just having ongoing conversations around that. For LGBTQ youth, I think, validating the worries, and I think the most important thing is that if you as a parent are supportive and loving, that is so protective and helpful for your kids. So knowing that you're still providing that space for them, and hopefully trying to help them find a community that is loving and supportive and accepts them as who they are. And I think it's a stressful time, but it is in Cambridge and in Boston. I think we are fortunate to be in a place that is more accepting than a lot of places in the country. And I think, again, if there are ways that you can help your child build community and make those connections with people who are going to be supportive, that's the most important thing.
Thank you. Alice, thoughts about those two areas?
I want to second something Emily said about kids saying they were like relieved that there was this rule in place. And I want to remind parents that the relationship you have with your child is the most sacred relationship they'll ever have in their lives. And you are most important. You are the sun around which everything kind of revolves, no matter what your child may be saying to you in the moment. And even the most sardonic 8-year-old can try to lay waste to a relationship with lots of rejecting and negative comments, but they're really just evidence of connection. And we want our children to experience the full range of their emotions, even if it feels sometimes like that's directed at us. Emily is very good at bringing in the elements of structured trauma processing into this moment, which is to find out what your children are seeing and hearing, so you can correct any kind of things that are incorrect. After 9/11, there were many kids at our school who felt like hundreds of planes had landed in hundreds of buildings because they watched the same loop of news. And it was so important that they could tell us that, and as horrific as it is, we could keep it the right size. So that having that conversation and finding out, what are you seeing? What are you hearing about is really important. After Trump was elected, my 16-year-old came to me in the car on the way to school. She asked me if the president could make her mother and I get divorced. Could he just say, you have to get divorced? And I was like, no. And as much as I feel as a queer person of age 70, I feel my felt sense is that somebody's trying to come for me. And it definitely activates some anxiety on my part around this vague unease about what's happening and whether it might kind of deeply impact me. But of course, I told my daughter no. And I said, Mommy and I made a lot of plans before marriage was recognized on a federal level to take care of each other. That's why I adopted you and your sister. That's why we put all this paperwork in place. And so, no, Trump cannot make us get divorced. And our love is much bigger than that. And she sat back in the car. She was like, oh, phew. I said, what did you think would happen? She said, oh, I thought like one of you would have to move out. Like she was genuinely concerned. And I'm so glad that she was able to share that with me. And I think that it's really about continuing to check in and ask those questions. Am I worried? Yeah, I am worried. I'm very worried for the young trans people that I know, very worried. And I think it's hard enough. It's hard enough to be feeling like you have finally arrived at the identity that makes sense to you. And now thousands of people are telling you that that's the worst thing you could possibly be. And when I talk to young trans people that I know, they are just trying to go from day to day without panicking about, what will happen to them. There is some kind of gallows humor out there where people are like, my mom says she'll give me her hormones if I can't get any, and then I'll be okay. Like there's some of that happening, but it makes me feel angry personally that we're exposing these young people to that level of derision and fear. And I think whenever that happens, whether it's a child who came from a terrible situation somewhere else and now arrives in front of you, we need to provide as much safety and reassurance as possible. And we need to help, as Emily said, people not to feel isolated, because when we are isolated, our thoughts can sometimes kind of circle the drain. So in those connections, social connections, community connections, support group connections, young people who are having the same experience are able to support one another just by virtue of sharing, what they're experiencing. I think those things are super important.
Great. Ugh. I'm so glad your daughter could talk openly. And I think that's something you both have emphasized, the real importance of open communication and kids.
And I want to say that sometimes that doesn't happen the first time. Like there are times when young people don't want to talk to us about things because they think we won't understand or that we're stupid. Mark Twain said his parents became very stupid when he was 17 and they didn't retain their intelligence until he was in his mid-20s. So I understand that part of the piece of development that has to do with becoming an individual sometimes means separating from people by telling them you don't like them anymore, or they're not valuable. And the fact is, we just have to keep asking. And if the one way of asking doesn't work, we have to get creative about other ways. So I've said to parents, I want you to ask your child to go out for dinner with you and say, what night do you want to go out for dinner? Then there's a question and there's no. There's no is not an answer. You just get to pick the night. If your child is disengaged from you, start leaving them notes. The visual pathway is very strong. And so even if someone is furious with you, they will read what you wrote to them because they want to know. So I think that there are always ways of reopening access or gaining access to start that conversation. And sometimes young people don't like to say out loud what scares them. So saying, we are all afraid about what's happening right now, where no one is not. So we are all managing this uncertainty. And the best way to do that is by being closer and telling each other what is our experience.
Yeah, thank you. Emily, you had alluded to the environmental stuff and the terrible fires around LA, and climate change has definitely been a huge part of the conversation for a long time. And now I think it's easy to feel like we're going backwards, where we were already not in a good position to fight it. And for those of us who are older, it's not whatever, it's going to be our children's issue, unfortunately, and their children's. So Alice, any thoughts, stuff you've heard from the schools about climate, and any ideas about ways to talk to our kids about that?
Well, I'm going to jump back to something Emily talked about earlier, which was about finding a way to get involved. I think when we see a situation that makes us feel helpless, we don't want to sink under the weight of that, but we want to build efficacy for young people. So what are the things I can change in my home and in my life that make a difference? And what are the things I can do on a maybe not global, but maybe a community-based level to help me feel like I'm not a victim of this, I'm actually contributing to the change. And sometimes for young people, that's a small thing, just what can we do? And sometimes it's a larger thing about, making a statement or doing public action or doing public service. And that feeling of at least I have a little bit of efficacy protects the brain from falling into like, it's all over, we're all helpless, and it just goes down from here. On a global scale, I don't know what to say about the direction that this is headed. It seems horrifying to me. And I don't feel like the people who are in charge care about this in the same way that some others, including myself, might. I'm hoping that that there are enough people who do care, who will speak truth to power, and that will help us. I think anytime there's a natural disaster in which there is death, destruction, and mayhem, this is a big thing for young people to comprehend. We are taught as people generally to mourn one discrete death at a time. Maybe an uncle dies, or a grandmother, or a cousin, and we have rituals around this, and we grieve, and then we cling to life itself. When there is death on this scale, and this was true in the pandemic as well, it kind of overloads the brain a little bit in terms of this neurobiological trauma response around, like, I can't even comprehend the scope of this. I can't, it's too big. And in those moments, I think it's really important for ourselves and for young people to focus on this concept that I call the next right thing. So sometimes if our brains are overwhelmed and our amygdalas are hijacked and we're not thinking that straight, but we have a lot of feelings, the only thing we can think about is right now in this moment, what is the next right thing? So I went to school, and now I came home and I'm going to do some homework, and then I'm going to have dinner, and I'm going to hang out with my family. And, that step by step, this forward motion into the next right thing helps to bind some of the anxiety that young people are feeling. I don't know if you see this, Dr. Goldman, I see a lot more somatic complaints in young people than I have in a long time. Headache, stomach ache. I had a third grader tell me last week that he was sure he had slipped a disc at recess. So I don't know where that came from, but
Probably a parent.
I think a lot of young people have their feelings wind up somewhere in their body, and that becomes, something else that we have to help with. Yeah.
Yeah. I do have a few thoughts about that. And you guys had talked about COVID, or you had, Alice. And I think we all know that was a huge time of anxiety in children and adults. And it was just, as a healthcare worker, it was just overwhelming, so much anxiety, and not enough places for people to go and talk to. And then in medicine, we have this thing called the positive review of systems, which just means I had a couple of patients like that yesterday, just where someone you say, any chest pain? Yes. Any stomach pain? Yes. Any headaches? Yes. Where everything hurts and everything's bad. And that for us is a sign of anxiety and often depression. And so, and often I'll say to a patient, often when we see someone who has so many things that are bothering them, it can mean that life is really hard and there's a lot of stress, and they'll say, yeah, that's true. So anyway, kids, of course, will show that too. So completely agree. And yeah, for these kids who've grown up during this COVID time and now the Trump time, it's just a lot of scary stuff. So yeah, definitely. So Emily, any thoughts about, you talked that you actually have done some research on disasters and so on, and any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think echoing a lot of what Alice said about, trying to get involved, and thinking about if your kid is anxious about climate change, helping them to kind of take action, whether it's in your home or in their school or at the neighborhood level. Are there things they can do to advocate for environmentally friendly practices? I think we're talking about so many different issues today, and they're all so important. And I think it can feel so overwhelming too, to feel like, oh, there's so many different areas that that are problematic right now and where we need people to be working on these issues. And I think the danger is just getting really disheartened and feeling like, oh, there's just nothing I can do, and kind of having that feeling of giving up. And I think what is most helpful for me when I have feelings like that is trying to really think about like what is most important to you and what is an area that you can really focus on, and trying to get some depth, instead of feeling like scattered and trying to pay attention to everything. We can't pay attention and kind of like fix everything. So, if there's a particular issue that you or your child feels really passionate about, I would try to go in depth and meet people who are working on that issue, and volunteering and advocating for that issue, and try to kind of focus your efforts. So if that's climate change, try to be focused on climate change and working deeply on that, and trust that there are people working deeply on the other problems that you also care about a lot. So that's something that has been helpful to me when I'm feeling really overwhelmed, is to try to think about that going deeply instead of focusing broadly, because we can't really focus broadly as humans. But I think, there are ways, if you're really concerned about natural disasters, you can do an online free training in psychological first aid, which is an intervention that is, shown to be helpful for communities in the immediate aftermath of disasters. Helps to establish safety and stabilization and connect people to resources they need. So, there are actions you can take to kind of go more in depth and help your community be more resilient and prepared in the event of a disaster. So I would say those are really great trainings if you want to go deeper on that issue in particular.
Great. And actually in our city in our public health department, we have some great people who offer that psychological first aid, and did a session with us with our task force last year, which was really great. So if people are looking for that, it's available in our.
Yeah, and I see that people are sharing some resources in the
cool.
Q&A too for organizations that are working on some of these things. So that's great. People can check those out.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like there's certainly been a lot of news about how so many people, with the first Trump administration, so many people were so filled with energy to protest and work against it, and how there's not that feeling now. But I guess I would hope that we can continue to help, especially our kids, feel hopeful in ourselves, and so not to just give up and give into it. And certainly there are things happening at my hospital in that direction, which is great, because I think, as you both have said, if you feel like things are hopeless, you will lose hope. And so showing the possibilities. And then I was hoping we could talk a little bit about situation for immigrant children, immigrant families. Certainly in Cambridge and Boston, we have lots and lots of immigrants. Maybe everybody remembers or heard in the news that the population of Massachusetts really grew last year for the first time in a long time, and it's because of the immigrants we've had. And I also, mentioning all these different things that have affected me, I saw over the last year many migrants who came under Biden's humanitarian relief program, largely from Haiti, but also from Venezuela. And babies were born, and those people are really frightened now because they probably will be sent back. So anyway, any thoughts about that? And we'll start with you, Emily. Any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, I think it's such a scary time. I think knowing your rights as an immigrant is really important right now. And I've seen some information circulating about, if ICE comes to your door, keep your door closed. You do not have to let them in unless they have a warrant signed by a judge with your correct name and address. So I think like knowing those types of things about the rights that you have, even if you are not a citizen, or regardless of your immigration status, you do have rights. Knowing that you have the right to an attorney, you have the right to remain silent and, not disclose your immigration status to police or immigration agents. I think all of those things are really important. And, depending on the age of kids, it'd be important to talk to kids about knowing their rights as well. And if they have concerns or questions about what to do in different situations, helping to answer those questions. I think it again goes back to like, if there's anything that they've heard that may not be accurate, correcting that. There's so much confusion and uncertainty right now, which is really anxiety provoking, but trying to, get your kid accurate information. And I think just doing your best to keep your family safe and to reassure your child of the steps that you're taking to keep your family safe. But yeah, it's a really scary time.
Yeah. And I'll just add before I get to you, Alice, I'm really interested about the schools and what's going on, that we just had a training yesterday, and it's true in all healthcare situations that ICE is not allowed to come into them. They're not allowed to talk to our patients. We're not permitted to talk about our patients with anybody unless they have these legal things. And it's actually, I mean, they could sneak in, I suppose, but all our front desk has gone through trainings, and people at the hospital. So Alice, your thoughts on this and any particular things going on at the schools?
Well, we've been really proactive at the schools about letting people who are school-based know like who can come in and who can't. So without a specific warrant, or even with a warrant, we've been instructed to let no one in the school and to simply call the superintendent's office about that immediately. This has not happened so far. We have a lot of Haitian immigrants in Cambridge, and I can't even imagine the pressure that they're living under. But I also have found that that the family connections in these families are very deep and strong. And there's a lot of reassurance, maybe even more than we might do under normal circumstances, that we are safe right now, that we are safe here, that we are safe as a family, that your parents or caregivers are doing everything they know how to do to make sure that we create and maintain that safety. And even when situations are more vulnerable, like we're in a shelter, we're not at home, we're, we don't have a home, that caregivers are reassuring young people about their own safety. And I think this is really important. And there are times in life when we do that, when maybe we're not sure we feel that. After the 9/11 incident, many students at the Manville School asked me, is it over and are we safe now? And I went right to the Mr. Rogers line, like, let's talk about what happened. Let's look for the helpers. Let's see all the people who are helping. And I didn't share my own worries or anxieties or ambivalences about any of that. So I'm not suggesting that we directly lie to young people, but there are some times when withholding some information helps young people feel more reassured. And then if they are deeply concerned and want more information, young people are very good at asking for that, either with their behavior or with a direct question. So if there is anxiety in a young person, we will see it. We'll see it in abrupt changes in behavior, or behavior that might not necessarily look help-seeking, but actually is. And there was just a group this morning of, there's a Haitian affinity group at one of the upper schools, and the facilitators asked if they would ask the young people if, something was worrying them about this, and they did, and the answer was no, we're okay. So that was an interesting moment. There are many opportunities in Cambridge to have groups conducted in your own language about your rights. And Marc can tell you how to connect with them. We send out flyers every time we hear about something. So there are resources that are available. This is true, I think, everywhere, Boston, Chelsea in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, I like how you both have quoted Mr. Rogers. Definitely, yeah, no, really, such a reassurance.
Emily, you look awfully young to be quoting Mr. Rogers. Okay.
He has universal appeal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And can you guys talk a little bit more about, you've both alluded to it, about parents and caretakers and their own anxieties, and just a little bit more thoughts. You've both talked about it a fair amount, so I don't know if you have anything else to add, but any other thoughts? Yeah, Alice, please.
I think anxiety is a neurobiological condition that affects the body, that starts in the brain with kind of a feeling of the polyvagal system being overwhelmed and one's rational coping skills feeling like less available. And each of us needs to develop our own strategies for the moments in which this is true, because it's happened to all of us. So we could look back at other really stressful times we've had and think about what did we do then that enabled us to kind of cope and get through. We can think about things we can do to provide relief to ourselves. So the 6 biggies for me to pay attention to with caregivers are, adequate sleep and nutrition, as Emily said earlier, exercise, having a community, feeling connected to a community, feeling like there is something that you can do personally that provides relief, and it's different for different people. It might be mindfulness for some people, it might be using nature, getting outside, but having a number of things that we can do that help us to feel a little less heightened or agitated. And I think recognizing when one feels that way and being able to tell somebody is also really important. Emily started with this, like being able to for a young person to be able to name something and be able to tell it to somebody is very different than feeling as an adult like you have to hold on to this all the time and just keep going. These kinds of anxieties are cumulative. And so if we don't do anything to kind of have some release and resetting or regrouping, then we have less resilience and we're unable to deal with other challenges as they come up. And we can see this already in adults who have lower frustration tolerance, bigger reactions to small things, a difficulty solving problems together, some feelings that others are organized against you in some way or trying to prevent you from getting what you want or need. So I think it's really important that we give voice to those things so that we can keep them kind of the right size. And I also think that the body in and of itself is pretty good at calming down if we give it a chance. So even sitting it quietly and breathing allows the brain to kind of reset and regroup, but we can't rush that. We have to give it a chance. Like this is particularly hard, I think, for young boys who really struggle with feeling upset and feeling like that, it's not okay. The other day, a boy was upset about something at an elementary school, and he came out of a classroom and he was snapping this clipboard and yelling really loud and kind of hurled himself onto this little naugahyde couch. And the teacher saw me, so she went back into the classroom. I had never met this child before, and I just went to him and I said, listen, I know you don't know me, but do you mind if I sit next to you while you're upset? And he said, oh, nodded his head, and I sat down and I just said, I notice you're breathing really well right now, and I just want you to know that your body knows how to calm down by itself if you just, give it a minute. So then this tear falls onto this couch. And I say, I noticed that you're crying, which I think is fabulous. I think it's so brave to have all your feelings, especially, like being a boy, like that's awesome. And your tears also serve a purpose. They help get some of these emotions out. They're different than the tears you cry when you like poke yourself in the eye by accident. And it's just like wicked brave. And then I said to him, like, you're like a knight at the round table right now, like just sitting in this bravery, and look how your body is breathing so much deeper and so much more. So I just kind of narrated for him the steps of like coming down off of this like really intense feeling. Anyway, we met each other for the first time about 10 minutes later when his teacher came out, and I introduced myself and I was like, something big just happened here. And I'm wondering, who can we tell? Like, who can we tell about this great thing that you did? And this idea, who can we tell, gives us multiple reinforcers for one event from lots of different people. So he said, oh, I'm going to tell my mom. I said, well, I'm going to check back and see how that went. So a few days later, I went back and I said, did you tell anyone? He said, I told my mom. I said, what did she say? Well, she said she was really proud of me. And I said, it sounds like you don't hear that a ton of times. And he was like, no, it was kind of a great moment. So I didn't see him for a long time. And then I saw him on his way out to recess, and he ran past me and waved his hand up in the air and said, I cried again. I feel like we had a chance in our in our own deep feelings to interrupt that cycle of anxiety. And we all know individually when it starts. It might start while you're driving, you start getting mad at everyone else on the road. It might start when you're trying to fall asleep and all those worries just come up like a big wave. And so I think if we can catch that and send our bodies signals through breathing, and it's interesting, the polyvagal system has a lot to do with regulating these intense feelings. And I have one of the things that aggravates teachers a lot is when kids are yelling outside or in the hallway, and I always say, they're just stimulating their vagal nerves. That's what yelling does. The vagal nerve runs right around the vocal cords. And when we're screaming, we give it a hug from the inside. So if you sing or hum or whisper, you can do the same thing. And it can just help to have a lot of strategies to get ourselves back down to that baseline when we get ratcheted up. And when you get ratcheted up as a parent, your thinking will become distorted because you can't help it. It's very hard to sit with that level of unease. So I think it's important to have things you can do automatically when this begins to reset yourself, to pivot. So you could open a window and take a few deep breaths. You could, if it's daytime, you could look out the window. Nature is super grounding. You can pivot away from a situation like you have two young siblings in a house and they just will not leave each other alone. And you can look away and then look back. And sometimes when you look back, you see something different. You don't see two kids fighting, you see two young people trying to play, and they just can't quite figure it out. They need your help. So I think all of these things, nature and pivoting and sitting still for a second, can really kind of help to reset our systems, which are delicate. It's a delicate system and it requires care. And now it requires even more care. So I think it's more than like, hey, did you have breakfast? It's much more like, what did you look at on the way to work? What are people who are buried in the news and really doom scrolling? I want to see the next bad thing. You're just not doing yourself any favors. And I think as parents, we know when our kids are upset. Nobody knows your kid better than you. So if you're worried about your child of any age, you can tell when something's different.
Mhm.
And then you can stop and check in.
I love that
Yeah.
story that you made him a knight of the round table. That's great. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, no, I just want to jump in there because we
Yeah.
do have a couple questions that are sort of Alice, on that last sort of thread idea you were talking about. And this is a couple folks posted that particularly around younger kids, a third grader and a toddler, like what are the signs of anxiety or stress that at that age when she can't fully communicate with us? Like what are some things that you will see in your child? And the questions were again sort of younger children, but also if maybe you can expand that to, because obviously kids, depending on their age and whatnot, they're going to express themselves differently. So what are some things parents should look out for, just to, if they're concerned about their kids or they're seeing a change in behavior?
Was this for you, Emily, the anxiety expert?
I think it could be for either of us.
Why
I'm
don't you
happy to
start,
talk about it a
Emily?
little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would say the good news maybe is that I've never encountered a toddler who is anxious about like world events. Now, I think it can have a huge impact on parents and us as adults and caregivers. And so I think that really comes back to, if these things are causing you a lot of stress, and causing just stress in the home, then that could certainly impact very young kids. And so I think that would go back to trying to take care of yourself and learning strategies to manage your own anxiety, which Alice was speaking about so wonderfully. I think very young kids, as Alice was saying, your kids best. I wouldn't necessarily expect that like world events are going to be concerning a toddler. But if there was something that directly impacted a toddler, like a natural disaster and your family had to evacuate your home, that could certainly have an impact. And I'd be looking out for like regressions in skills. If your kid was doing great with potty training and suddenly they're having a lot more accidents, that could be a sign of stress in a really young kid. And with really young kids, it can help to read books about difficult events and feelings. It can help to play and to follow your child's lead. But I would say really young kids, their worries and anxiety tend to be more about separation from parents and caregivers, or, things like fears of the dark, fears of thunderstorms, these kind of like concrete things that they're encountering. So I would be less concerned about a really young child's worries about like current events. I think as you get into school age kids, that might start coming up, and it would be, again, trying to answer their questions, letting their questions kind of guide what you're sharing. And I would also think about if you feel like you want to share. I think there was a question about like how much should I share with my elementaries. I think it was like third grader, about some of these like world events going on. And I think I would ask yourself what your goal is in having those conversations with your kid. If this is like something that you feel like is an important value to you, and you want to start talking to your kid about some of these social justice issues, then there might be some really good like children's books that you could start reading with your kid and talking about some of these things. If this is more of like you are concerned about what your child might be hearing at school, then it might be a different conversation of, asking them what they've heard and talking to them about that. So I think it really depends kind of what you are wanting to get out of those discussions with your third grader.
Any thoughts, Alice?
Well, again, I agree with Emily to let young people kind of take the lead. There are times when we have to have difficult conversations with our children about things that happen in the world. And then when we do that, I think we need to prime the brain a little bit. And by that, I mean, when your doctor tells you bad news, sorry, Dr. Goldman, they usually lead up to it. Maybe they say, oh, we got your test results back and they weren't exactly what we expected. So now your brain is like, oh, I'm going to hear something unexpected before you hear it. So if we're going to have a conversation like that with young people, I usually ask people to prime the brain. This comes up a lot in Cambridge when we talk about social studies. So we work a lot with the social studies department and saying, we're going to talk about colonialism. And a lot of people have feelings about this topic, and you might have some too. But we're going to talk about this together, and we're going to have time to talk about our feelings. And at the end of this, we're going to understand this better, and we're going to keep working with it until we understand it better. So if I have to say something that's difficult in that way, I'll say, I'm going to talk about something that might be hard to talk about, but I'm going to stay right here and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to be able to share our feelings, and we're going to be able to make choices about what we want to do about what we talked about. And I think that helps young people feel like, okay, so this might be weird, but I can do this and my people are here. And, so it isn't, it doesn't come out of the blue. I think that not shocking our children is a good rule of thumb. So if something comes up, I'm trying to think of an example. That I live in Cambridge near Fresh Pond. So the day of the shutdown and the marathon bombing, both my kids were pretty little. And I stayed home from work, and it wasn't until noontime that my older kid said, why did you stay home today? And there was no news to tell, so I didn't want to tell any news at all. So I said, oh, that person who called me this morning, they told me to stay home and clean the house. And that's what I was doing, because when I get really anxious, I clean. And so she accepted this at like age 8. She was like, oh, okay, that's what happened. And it wasn't until much later in the day that we had a different conversation about what had really happened that day. So I think, what am I trying to say? Sometimes we protect young people from that information, and sometimes we feel like, okay, I'm going to talk to you about this. We need to be in a well-regulated space when we do that. Because again, our kids take their cues from us. And if we can't talk about something without flipping out, then it's not time to talk about it.
Thank you. Mark, other questions?
Yeah. For the third grade example, parents have mentioned that their kids' peers have, 1, expressed fear that their parents will be arrested and sent away, or 2, mentioned they have to choose to be a girl or a boy, whereas now they're non-binary. I think it's the current administration's fueling these topics amongst kids. The parents were surprised the kids were discussing these topics and weren't sure how to respond to their kids, which is why I'm attending. Thank you again for hosting the panel. So, yeah, I mean, I think, it can feel, and you guys have, I mean, we're coming close to our time, and, you guys have, thank you so much. And it's so important to, I think, remind us as adults who can, we're not only worried about what's going on nationally and in the world, but we're worried about a million other things: paying the bills, health, our jobs, and it is really, as those of us who are social workers. I'm a social worker, and Alice and I go way back working together at the Manville
Right
School
after
a million
fire
years
was
ago.
discovered.
Huh?
I said right after fire was discovered.
Hey, my first day was 9/11, actually. And um, we say, you can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself, right? So if you walk away with nothing else, and I think hopefully you're going to walk away with a lot tonight, is that you have to take care of yourself, and it's not being selfish, and it's not being, it doesn't mean you're not a good parent because you're concentrating on yourself. You've got to make sure that you're finding ways to, manage your anxiety and your feelings. Otherwise, you're not going to be, as strong for your kids. So please make sure that you do that. But there's so many things. It feels like, I just want to ask them, just, it feels like you're drinking out of a fire hose, right? I mean, every day it's something new. Every hour it feels like it's something new. And so, um, can you talk a little bit more about, I know that you mentioned about how routines are important. Can you just touch on that a little bit more, and why routines are important for kids, and how that can be helpful when everything else seems so out of control and chaotic?
Well, structure binds anxiety. So working and functioning within a structure, I get up, I brush my teeth. This is how I drink my coffee, or this is how we have breakfast. This is our routine before we go to school. Things that we do automatically are comforting. So I think that structure is really important. So if there was a horrifying world event and you did not put your kids to bed on time and you all stayed up watching the news, I would say that's kind of a dangerous activity. I would also say that if a child were to say to me, like, there can only be 2 genders or blah, 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 I would say, that's wrong. Whoever said that was wrong. And that's all. That's wrong. So that's not something you have to ascribe to, debate, or worry about. It's just wrong. It's like what we used to say to kids, Mark, when they would say, oh, I'm so stupid. And we would say, you know what? Whoever told you that was lying. And that's the end of that. So I think it's important to, and Emily touched on this too, to find out what kids are thinking about so you can correct some of those assumptions. Kids believe that the grown-ups are in charge and that everyone has their best interests at heart most of the time. So if there's a grown-up out there who's talking trash or saying something that doesn't fit, it's important that we correct that. And that is a part of growing up, to understand that different people have different thoughts, feelings, and opinions. And while feelings might never be wrong, some of these opinions are fallacious and misinformed. And it's okay to say that's not, that you don't agree with that, or that's not true, or that's not something that our family believes in. And that's important for young people. And I think the structure and routine also has to do with expectation. Like, I expect that I'll come home from school and this will happen, and then this will happen, and then this will happen, and my parents will tuck me in, and maybe we'll hear a story. And if we begin to disrupt that, we create more anxiety, which is the last thing any of us wants to do right now. So whatever the expectations are in your family, it's good to stick with them, because when you don't, it sends a message that something is in fact kind of wacko. So even if it's hard to do, which it can be, to really pay attention to that, I think is really important.
Emily, anything
Um,
to add on that
I
one?
would just say, like, I think I agree that I think the question in the Q&A about the kids who were saying you have to now choose to be a boy or a girl. I think that's like a really good example of the type of kind of misinformation kids can, or maybe not intentional misinformation, but just misunderstandings that kids can have when they hear news. And it reminds me of the example that Alice was talking about earlier, where her child was concerned that she would have to get a divorce. And so I think that's like a great example of where you can correct that and say, you know, you can still be non-binary, you still are non-binary. And that's the end of that. No one can change that. And I think the fears about parents being arrested and sent away, you know, that's where if the concerns are about immigration, and it sounds like in this question, the person who read the question is in contact with the other parents. I think that would be a time where it'd be important that the parents of the kid who has those fears are talking to that kid. So if you know those parents, maybe you can connect with them and you know, let them know that their kid was having some fears about that, and hopefully they can provide some reassurance and some information that's accurate to their situation. But I think just also reassuring your kid that you're not going to be arrested and sent away if they had worries about that. And I think it's a great example of how it's important to find out what kids are talking about and what they're thinking and hearing, and being able to provide age-appropriate and accurate information to answer their questions and correct misconceptions.
I wanted to just make a couple points just from the city side on some of this stuff. Some of the topics that came up tonight. So just in terms of resources, mental health resources, you know, we know that mental health resources in our community are stretched pretty thin. You know, it could take a while if you to get a therapist, you know, in the community. But just so folks know that the Health Alliance, Cambridge Health Alliance, has just opened essentially a drop-in mental health clinic that you know, you literally can just walk in and say that you need to speak with someone, you know, because you know you need to, you know, you're not feeling right, or you know, want to talk to somebody. So that's I mean, that's a service it's in Avra, that's relative. I mean, I think it was probably, time sort of blurs, but that's like, it's not even 2 years old yet. I don't think so. So that's something that, you know, if you really feel like I really need to see somebody right now, or my kid needs to really talk to somebody right now, that is available to folks
It
at,
works great.
at the Health Alliance. I'm
It
sorry?
it works great. I've gone there with many parents and
Mm-hmm.
kids, and it's super, super quick.
Where
Really,
is it?
it's right in Cambridge Hospital on the first
Oh,
floor. You
great.
come
Great.
through the main entrance and
Yeah.
bear right. And
Yeah.
at the end of that hallway,
Mhm.
most times that I've been there with a family, the child has seen a social worker within 20 minutes.
Wow, it's great.
Yeah. So that's a great resource. As Alice has talked about, we have social workers in every school, we have psychologists in every school. So there are professionals, in the schools that not only are there for your kids, our kids, but are there for you too. If you need to reach out and ask for advice, that's available. On the immigration stuff, we tomorrow, the mayor, myself, the city manager, the superintendent of schools, um, a couple school committee members and other city department heads are going to be meeting to um, talk more formally about what um, our response is going to be should we start to see ICE activity here in the city. Alice, you already talked a little bit about this on the school side that, we're not letting ICE into the buildings, that we're not turning over any information. That's going to be the same in terms of, I think city buildings in addition to school buildings. There's a lot of talk about our being a sanctuary welcoming city and what that means. And it gets distorted. And I don't know if Trump and his folks, I think it's a little of both. They do it intentionally to distort it. And I also think they don't fully understand what it is. Basically, by being a sanctuary city, what it means is that our police department is not going to um, determine folks' documentation status for civil offenses. So if somebody, runs a red light and gets pulled over, we don't ask if they're documented or not documented. It doesn't mean, and this is what they try to say it means, but it doesn't mean that we are providing sanctuary or harboring people who commit crimes. If someone commits a felony, commits a crime, then and we find out that they're undocumented, that we don't say, oh, okay, well, now we're not going to arrest you. If you commit a felony, that, the police will respond to that. But the Mass Supreme Court said that cities do not, because being undocumented is a civil violation and not a criminal violation, that local police do not have to partake in federal enforcement. So that's kind of where we stand, and we've recommitted to that on the council and on the school side. We have something called the Commission for Immigrant Rights and Citizenship, CIRC, which is something the council started a few years back. They're doing a number of trainings in the community, know your rights trainings in the community, so folks know, what their rights are and how they can respond. Those trainings are open, will be, and anybody can go. There are going to be some training for providers specifically coming up. You can find that information on the city website. So just wanted to make sure folks knew that we are, on the policy side and the city administration side, really looking at all of these things very closely. The city manager committed today that if our nonprofits get federal funding cuts, that the city is going to work to make them whole and come up with the money to keep those services open so that we don't see a loss in services for our most vulnerable population. So I hope that gives folks some sense of, peace of mind that we're on it. So we're coming up to the end. I don't know if there's any last questions. I'll shut up now, but I just want to say thank you guys again for being here. I hope folks got a lot out of it. I know I did, and I really appreciate you being here. Avra, I'm going to kick it back to you. And
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I loved it and loved your stories. I don't know. you know, it's just the beginning. So obviously things go on, and we do encourage people to reach out to us if there are problems that come up. Any last thoughts or words? Emily, any last things?
Oh, I'll just say, I'm sorry, I said I'd shut up and here I go. I put a lot of information in the chat.
Yeah, yeah.
Folks
Great.
in the Q&A put a lot of great information and resources in, and so I moved those over to the chat. So check those out. And as far as books go for young kids, book I loved for my kids, How Are You Peeling? I think you can still get it. It's about all these little carved vegetables that have all these different emotions. And it's like this cute little, I could probably, if I think about it, do the whole book now. I read it so many times to them.
Sarah,
It's like this rhyming book about, are you feeling angry? Are you feeling, and it's all these little cute tomatoes and fruits and vegetables. Kids love it. So if you get a chance, that is a great book for, our 3 and 4 year olds.
That's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, and maybe we can send the resources as emails to participants afterwards, Pamela. That would be great. Emily, any last thoughts?
I think just like Alice said, think about the next right thing, one step at a time, one day at a time, and trying to stay in the present and not, think about, I'm safe right now in this present moment. My child is safe right now, can be grounding. And thank you all for coming and for sharing resources. And I think we're all gonna just keep going one day at a time.
Thank you. Alice, last thoughts? Or
all
story?
of our joy is in the present. So no one is home now saying on Friday morning at 8:10, I'm going to have joy whether I want it or not. All the joy that we feel of the spontaneity of connection and learning about ourselves and each other and raising kids is always in the present. And if we can't stay in the present, we will miss these opportunities that are so loving and connected and nourishing. So please, everybody, take really, really good care of yourselves, and so that you'll be available to joy when it pops up right in front of you. And there is joy, and there are things to feel gratitude about, even just the small G gratitude. Like I'm at that age now where when I open my eyes in the morning, I say, oh, good. So just looking for those things to feel grateful about alone and together with your family, and to stop and appreciate something is good for the brain. Laughter also really good for the brain. If it's possible to do something that you can enjoy together, watching or playing, that people will laugh about, also, can be very powerful. Energizing neurotransmitters that might be less available to us when we're super worried. Cartoons are still good.
Great. Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Really, it was really wonderful. I learned a ton. So thanks, and have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mark.
Thanks.
Emily, I hope we meet someday.
I know, me too. This was great. It was so nice speaking with you. And
You too.
yeah, I hope we meet in person.
Yeah.
Good night.
Um,